All right, so I figured it'd be worth taking a little bit of time to talk about Webpack again, to discuss how we use it in our starter applications. So we have this React starter app. We also have the Canvas starter application, both of which use pretty much the same Webpack configuration. We've managed to get Webpack to work with Rails, which means we do not take advantage of the Rails asset pipeline for the most part. Now I say for the most part because sometimes we'll use it for CSS, especially if there are certain libraries that depend on the Rails asset pipeline. Some gems will have CSS. Occasionally you'll have JavaScript that falls into that category too, in which case we would use the Rails asset pipeline, but normally we don't, not in our day-to-day development. So the way that we have things configured, the asset pipeline is available, but is not typically used. So, okay. So I wanted to walk through kind of just the configuration, how we got this to work with Ruby on Rails, because it's actually a little bit tricky. Not bad, but there are just a few bits and pieces of code that you have to scatter throughout your app. The first thing is inside of application.rb, which is global to your Ruby on Rails application, meaning it runs in your test environment, it runs in your development environment, it runs in production, it runs in staging, it runs in all of those. We just add this line right here. So we have config.webpack equals, and then this object, this hash, use manifest, asset manifest, common manifest. And basically we've just set these to some default values so that they aren't null when you access them in development or in test. All right, so then inside of production, we make one change to that, which is we say use the manifest. We set that to true. And it'll become clear why we set these values here when we look at the helper. So we have this Webpack Helper right here. This is how we embed Webpack into our web pages. And for the most part, you'll never have to touch any of the code that I've just shown you. If you're building your own Ruby on Rails application, you can just copy and paste it out of this application. Other than that, if you're using one of the starter apps, it's all done, but it's worth knowing kind of what's happening behind the scenes. So there are two helper methods. One is the Webpack bundle tag, the other is the Webpack manifest script. If we go to one of the pages where we embed an application that we kind of build with Webpack, you'll see a couple of, well, you'll see both of those helper methods get called. So here's the Webpack manifest script. We just embed it directly into the page. And here's the Webpack bundle tag, which says there's a JavaScript file called app out there, and that's what you'll need to load into this page in order to run the application. So let's see how those are built. So Webpack Helper, the Webpack bundle tag is what emits the JavaScript tag into the page. That's this right here. You have to call HTML safe, of course, because we're emitting a script tag into the page, which is normally a very bad idea. But in this case, we control source, so it's okay. Now we have to see how we set up the source value where the JavaScript is going to come from. So if we are in a mode where use manifest is true, then we're going to do this stuff, which I'll talk about here in just one sec. But this is what normally happens. In all of our development, it just loads the Webpack bundle.js, which comes off of the asset server. So that's what the assets URL is, meaning we're using the Webpack hot reload functionality to serve the assets, which is why you have to start up two servers whenever you start up one of these starter applications. That's why we went to using Foreman, because you have to start so many things. The Webpack hot reload server allows you to make a modification to a file inside the app, and then it automatically reloads inside of the browser. So we wanted to take advantage of that functionality, which is why we have this assets URL, and we have Webpack serving the assets in development mode. If you are in production, remember back here in production.rb, we say use manifest equals true. Then in that case, this will be true. We load the manifest based on the asset manifest right here. And then we look for this bundle, and I'll show you how some of this code works here in a second. And that bundle basically is the Webpack bundle, but it looks like this thing over here. It has a hash in the name. So that helps when you are dealing with caching. Normally the Rails asset pipeline would do that for you, but in our case, since we're using Webpack, we have Webpack do a build with a hash in the name, and then we have to have a way to get a hold of that name, and the way that we get a hold of it is by embedding the Webpack manifest directly into the page and then pulling it out in this code right here. So, actually, sorry, I take that back. This code is, we generate the manifest when we do the build, and this code pulls it out of the built code. We also do embed it in the page, but for some other reasons. Okay. So looking here, we've got this webpack.rb. This is, if we say use the manifest, then this is how we go out and get the Webpack asset manifest, the Webpack common manifest, and then we can read those files and make that data available inside of these values, which are, the asset manifest, the common manifest, which if you remember back here in application.rb, they're set to an empty hash, so that's what gets used in development. But inside of production, which is where use manifest is set to true, we load these values, parse the JSON, and then put those put the results into these two hashes right here. Okay. So then going back over to the helper, we have the Webpack Manifest script, and so if we're going to use the manifest, this piece of code gets executed right here, and you can see that we take the common manifest, we turn it back into JSON, and that's what we stick inside of the web page. All right, so all of that is kind of a lot of complication, and like I say, for the most part, you won't have to worry about it unless you run into some weird bugs, and if you want to use this, you can copy and paste it into your Rails application. Okay. So then looking here at index.js, you can see we load default client settings. That's data provided by the server to the client. Things like the current user ID would be an example, or the JWT, the JOT token, we send down in the default client settings. Here's the manifest script. This main div is where we load our React applications. We put it in above the app because we've noticed that if you put it in after, you run into a couple of errors. I did a blog post on that. I can link to in the notes. All right, so now that we've done all of that, it means Webpack is now available to us. Okay, so I'm going to close a lot of this other stuff. So Webpack, why do we use Webpack? If you don't use Webpack for any other reason, use it because your code gets to use a little bit of ES6 syntax, specifically the import statement. If you don't know how to use any other ES6, then you should appreciate that you can use import, and now JavaScript has a common and standard way of dealing with dependencies between your files. So back in the day, and even now when you write code, like for example with the Rails asset pipeline, you would write a JavaScript file and your functions might be global, or they might not. They might just have one object. And then you would write another piece of JavaScript that depends on that, and you had to make sure that that second piece was included after the first piece, and you'll see that in a lot of notes, like this file requires the jQuery be loaded before you load this file. So then you ended up with this nightmare of what order are my JavaScript files going to be loaded in? And then you go write a new file, and you'd have to figure out what it depended on and insert it in the correct load order. That gets to be unmanageable once you are writing a very complicated JavaScript application, because it's just too hard to reason about all of the different dependencies and keep everything in the right order. And so you would run into all kinds of errors. So ES6, one of the really, or ES 2015, depending on what you like to call it, one of the nicest features was they included this, they added this import statement. So now I can import my different libraries from the files where they live, and they are included, and they're all included in the correct order. So Webpack will go through all of my files. It will make sure React is only included once, and it will include it in the correct order, and it will make sure that it is available when this code executes. All right, so that's one big reason to use Webpack. We use it for a lot of other reasons. One, we also use it to transpile our code using Babel. So that lets us use a lot of the ES6 and even ES7 features. So now you kind of have an overview of what we do with Webpack. Let's talk about this Webpack config file. All right, so in all of our projects, you'll see this Webpack hot over here on the left. There's Webpack hot, Webpack release, and Webpack tests. All right, so Webpack hot is what we use in development mode. You see it starts this Webpack dev server. That's what allows for the hot reload. It includes this Webpack config right here that we'll talk through. And then you give it a mode like, are we in release, which in this case is always going to be false, or are you in production, which it will build your code a different way in production. Let's see. So this is just what you need the configuration to start up the Webpack dev server. And you can see that it starts listening on the hot port, which is defined in settings, which is actually defined in the .env file. So in all these projects, you'll see this .env, this assets port. This is where the Webpack hot reload server starts. All right. So in release, it's even simpler. We just set release to true. It gives us a Webpack config where that's true, which we then export. And then we have a method in package.json you can run. You do npm run build, and it will run Webpack config, and it grabs that release one, and then it generates the released code, which has less stuff and is completely, well, I'll show you what it looks like. It looks like this. It's only 63 lines long, but it's like 1,000,000 columns wide. It has shrunk, uglified, included things in the correct order, and otherwise turned into a really ugly file. But this is executable JavaScript that matches all of the code that we've been writing. Okay, so going into the Webpack config, Webpack uses an object to indicate how the files, how it should behave, how it should build files, what transpilers, well, in this case, I call them loaders, what loaders should be used. So this piece of code basically builds that configuration file based on the settings that are specific to each developer's machine. So right here you can see we have auto prefix with all these different browsers, and we have some CSS loaders. So Webpack can build your CSS, whether it is Sass or less, it doesn't matter, it will build both. And in some cases, we've actually had to use the Webpack CSS loading functionality specifically because the app that we were working on used two different versions of Bootstrap. So there was a Bootstrap 2 and a Bootstrap 3. We let the Rails asset pipeline handle the Bootstrap 2, and then we use Bootstrap 3 by having Webpack put it all together from the less files and then inject it into the page. All right, so you can see we've got the SCSS loaders. Here's some less loaders. These are available. We don't use them all that much, but if you wish to use less or Sass and require them inside of your JavaScript files, you can do that, and Webpack will make that happen. The more interesting part of this is the JS loaders. Specifically, we're using the Babel loader. We've set this to stage 0. So what that means is we can use a whole bunch of the experimental features, which are very popular, things like the splat operator. So if you've ever seen the code that looks like this, where you have the first object and then the second object here making some kind of a new object, that's, I believe, an ES7 or 2016 feature, which would not work if you did not say stage 0 and include this optional runtime. So this includes some code that Babel has that lets you run some of these future features. It also lets you do things like async await, which we use in the API.js along with a generator function.
Just on the splat, that's 3 dots, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it's supposed to be 3 dots. Sorry. Thanks. Yeah. So that would be the correct way to do that. All right, so we're gonna get rid of that. So that's important to note, because if maybe you just turn on stage 0, but you don't include the runtime, you'll get some runtime errors that are really confusing. So just remember, if you use some of those advanced features, you need to have that turned on. All right. So I'm going to skip over some of this stuff. This is just building the objects, setting up the Webpack dev server, and so on. Here we have the entry. So this indicates what the file is that needs to be built. And so that's the stuff I skipped up here, is it's just putting those entries together. In most cases, that's app.jsx. So this app.jsx, the reason this gets built as kind of the main, the initial file, is because that's what we tell Webpack, close these down, that's what we tell Webpack to build here in this entries. And the entries are actually in settings.js. So if you ever need to add additional entries, you can just open up settings.js and add it right here. So let's see, if I remember right, you could call it, say I was building a new, maybe something that was smaller, maybe like a search application in React. So I could do something like this. And now, in addition to app, I could also do search. And then when I include that in a page, let's see, I gotta remember where these are, right here. Instead of Webpack bundle tag app, I would do Webpack bundle tag search. And that's all you'd have to do. So then you can add a whole bunch of React applications if you need that. And in some cases, we have needed to add multiple React applications to a single app. All right, so the rest of this, you can see here's where we set up the assets port. We actually pull that out of the environment. That's the .env file. There's some other stuff, like we grab the title, the author. We get that out of the package.json. You can see that right here. So whatever you've set inside of package.json here, the name, the version, here's the author. We pull that information out, and it's available to us in the settings object, which sometimes is useful because we can include that in copyright headers or something like that if we need. Again, for the most part, you probably won't need to touch settings unless you're adding an additional app. Okay. So that's what entry does, is it says here's the things you're supposed to go out and build. Output says here's the stuff that you're supposed to output. So you start in app.jsx, you figure out all the dependencies, you put all that file into one thing, and then you output it to this path right here. So if we're in release mode, it'll output it to the prod output. If we're in dev, it goes to dev output. Those are all set up for you, but prod output is going to end up eventually in the asset pipeline, I think. Or maybe it just dumps it straight into public. The dev output writes it to a location that it's available to the hot reload server. I don't think it actually writes it out. Let me look real quick. Oh, it does write it. It writes it out into the app directory. And so for production, it writes it into the build directory, which it's then moved into the asset pipeline. Sorry. Okay. Some of this other stuff just tells how you, we got this ID chunk hash. See, ID is app. There's the chunk hash, so that lets us output a file name based on the hash so that we can take advantage of caching at the browser level. This says resolve extensions with JS, JSON, and JSX. And this is how we can do things like import React from React. We don't have to include the full node modules path there because we tell Webpack to resolve stuff that lives in node modules. We also tell it to resolve stuff that lives in vendor, but for the most part, vendor is usually empty. Yeah. Okay, these are just some Webpack settings. So we turn on colors. Don't mess with these. It's hard to, if you mess with them, oftentimes your builds will start to fail and you'll be like, what is going on? All right, we've got plugins. So Webpack allows you to do plugins. In this case, when we are in release mode, we have a node environment set to production. We've defined that as a plugin, which basically just says define, make this object, use this object to set an environment variable. You can see we've got uglify. This gets rid of duplicates. This, I think, sets the correct ordering. Some of these I don't remember. Basically, these are just there to build your application in the most aggressive way possible to crunch them down into as small of code as possible. All right, so this is all for release. This stuff is for development, and you can see that we don't have very many. We've got this hot module replacement plugin that allows us to use the hot reload on the Webpack dev server. All right, so this is the most interesting part right here, are the loaders. So we have a loader for JS, we have a loader for JSX. In this case, both of them are coming, they use the exact same JS loaders, which is basically, it's going to use Babel to transpile all of the JavaScript that you've written. This says don't go search through the node modules directory. If you do that, you'll be waiting around basically forever while it tries to transpile the entire node modules directory, which is not what you want. Here's the loaders for CSS, SAS, CSS, and LAS. Wow. And we also have image loaders. So this is just using a URL loader, but you can, if you want, enable a different loader. I think it's, let's see, we've got the file loader, image Webpack loader right here. We'll try to optimize your images. If you wanted to basically optimize your images before you release, Webpack can do that as well. We've turned that off because it takes it a little while, but it's available if that ever makes sense for a given project. There's a Webpack compile templates loader that you can apply to HTML. This is if you want to put _JS templates inside of your HTML. We don't do this very often, but those are there. There's a bunch of other loaders available as well, if that makes sense. Okay, so to this point, are there any questions about this Webpack config? Does anybody have questions about Webpack in general? Okay, I'll assume that's a no. So, great tool. It's probably what we'll use going forward for a very long time. Kind of a pain to configure, but once you get it configured, you usually don't have to think about it ever again. Maybe I think we did talk about karma.conf in one of the other daily trainings. We'll talk about that one again because we use Karma with Webpack so that we can basically have Karma do the same, well, so that Karma uses Webpack to do the build so that our tests run on the same kind of code that we put out into production. Okay, that's it. Thank you much.
Thank you.
Thanks.